The morning sky over New Terra was painted in shades of purple and orange as the twin suns began their daily rise. Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the orbital defense station and watched the planet below with quiet pride. 3 generations of humans had called this world home, and it showed in every city and every farm that dotted the continents. His own parents had been among the first settlers, and now his sister lived down there with her 2 boys. The station was quiet during these early hours, and Jake liked it that way because it gave him time to think about how far humanity had come. Lisa Warren was running diagnostics on the Outer System Patrol when her sensors picked up something strange. The readings made no sense at first, because nothing should have been able to enter the system without triggering the early warning buoys. She checked the data again and felt her blood turn cold as 17 massive ships materialized from hyperspace at the edge of the system. They were not human ships, and their energy signatures matched nothing in the Federation database. She opened the emergency channel to command, and her voice was steady, despite the fear climbing up her spine. The Calreth Empire had arrived without warning, and without any attempt at communication. Jake received the alert and immediately ordered all stations to battle readiness, but even as he gave the commands, he knew they were hopelessly outmatched. The defense station had been built to handle pirates and smugglers, not a full military invasion force. He tried to hail the incoming ships, but received only silence in return. The Calreth fleet moved with terrible purpose, and their formation spoke of military precision that came from centuries of conquest. He ordered every civilian ship to evacuate and sent priority warnings to the surface, but he knew in his heart that there would not be enough time. Paul Henderson was having breakfast with his family when the sirens began to wail across the capital city. His wife Kate looked up from her coffee with confusion, because there had not been a drill scheduled for today. Their daughters Emma and Sophie stopped arguing about their homework and stared at their parents with wide eyes. Paul checked his military comm unit and felt the world tilt sideways as he read the emergency broadcast. Enemy fleet inbound. All civilians to evacuation centers immediately. He grabbed Kate's hand and told her they needed to leave right now, but she wanted to pack some things, and he had to shout at her that there was no time for anything except running. The streets were chaos within minutes as millions of people tried to reach the spaceports and evacuation centers. Paul pushed through the crowds with his family close behind, but the press of bodies was overwhelming. He could see the transport, ships lifting off in the distance, and knew they would never make it in time. Kate was crying and holding both girls tight as they ran. Sophie kept asking what was happening, and Emma was too scared to make any sound at all. Paul made a decision and pulled them toward the underground shelters instead, because at least there they might have a chance. Lisa watched from her ship as the Calreth fleet entered orbit and began positioning themselves over every major population center. She screamed into the comm for them to stop, but her words meant nothing to the alien warships. The first kinetic strike hit the northern continent, and she saw the flash of impact from millions of kilometers away. Then another strike hit, and soon the entire planet was being bombarded with weapons that fell from the sky like the wrath of angry gods. She tried to move her ship closer, but Admiral Cole ordered her to hold position because there was nothing anyone could do now except bear witness to what was happening. Jake activated every weapon his station possessed and fired at the nearest Calreth ship, but his weapons barely scratched their shields. The return fire was swift and brutal as enemy plasma torpedoes tore through his station's hull like it was made of paper. Half his crew died in the first volley, and the rest scrambled to reach the escape pods. He stayed at his post because someone needed to keep transmitting the warning to any human ships that might be coming to help. The station shook with another impact, and he could hear the hull groaning as it began to break apart. He thought about his sister and his nephews on the planet below, and wondered if they had found shelter before the end came. The bombardment continued for 6 hours without pause. Every city was targeted, and every town and every farming community that showed signs of human habitation. The Calreth used kinetic weapons that hit with the force of nuclear bombs but left no radiation behind. They were surgical in their destruction and methodical in their thoroughness. Paul huddled in the shelter with Kate and the girls as the ground shook and shook and shook. The lights went out and emergency power kicked in, but even that began to fail after the 3rd hour. People around them were praying and crying and holding each other because everyone knew what was happening above their heads. When the bombardment finally stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. Lisa ran every scan she could think of and checked the results 3 times because she could not believe what her instruments were telling her. There were no life signs on New Terra, not in the cities and not in the shelters and not anywhere on the entire planet. 2 million people had lived there that morning, and now there was nothing but cooling rubble and dust. She sent the report to Admiral Cole with shaking hands, and then she turned her ship away because she could not bear to look at what New Terra had become. Jake managed to reach an escape pod before his station exploded, but he floated in space for 8 hours before a rescue ship found him. He did not speak during the rescue, and he did not speak during the medical examination afterward. The doctors said he was in shock, but that was not quite right, because shock implied that the mind would eventually process what had happened. Jake knew he would never process this, and he did not want to, because the moment he accepted it as real was the moment he would have to admit that his sister and his nephews were gone forever. The Calreth fleet broadcast their message on every human communication channel. Their Admiral Vorthen appeared on the screens with his 4 eyes and his scaled face, and his voice that sounded like gravel being crushed. He explained that humanity had expanded too aggressively and had shown too much ambition for a young species. New Terra was a lesson and a warning that the galaxy belonged to the older races. Humans would now accept their place as a tributary species under Calreth protection, or more worlds would share New Terra's fate. He spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had done this before to other species and expected no real resistance. President Helen Crawford watched the broadcast from Earth and felt something cold settle into her bones. She looked at her cabinet and saw the same expression on every face. They had all lost someone on New Terra because nearly every family in the Federation had relatives there. The Secretary of Defense asked what their response should be, and Helen stood up slowly. She would address the Council within the hour, and the galaxy would learn that Vorthen had made a terrible mistake. He had studied human wars and human diplomacy, but he had not studied what humans became when someone murdered their children. Helen Crawford stood before the United Earth Council, and the chamber was so quiet that every breath could be heard. She had prepared a long speech about diplomacy and measured response, but when she opened her mouth, different words came out. There would be no negotiation with the Calreth Empire, and there would be no surrender, and there would be no mercy for those who had killed their children. The speech lasted 90 seconds, and when she finished, half the council members were crying, and the other half were nodding with grim determination. The vote for total war was unanimous, and it took less than 5 minutes to pass every emergency measure that the military had requested. Richard Cole had spent 40 years in the fleet advocating for peaceful exploration and scientific cooperation with alien species. He had written 3 books about the importance of diplomatic solutions and had personally negotiated treaties with 7 different civilizations. Now he walked into the War Ministry building and requested full mobilization of every military asset humanity possessed. The young officer at the desk looked confused because Admiral Cole was famous for his peaceful stance, but Cole just stared at him until the officer processed the paperwork. Cole had lost his grandson on New Terra, and the boy had been only 5 years old and had loved dinosaurs more than anything in the world. The Calreth Empire watched human fleet movements with casual interest because the math was simple and obvious. Vorthen had 1,700 warships under his command, representing 14 different species that served the Empire. Humanity had perhaps 300 ships that could be called combat effective, and most of those were patrol boats and system defense craft. The odds were roughly 6-1 in favor of the Calreth, and that was being generous to the humans. Vorthen sent a message to his subordinates telling them to prepare for a short campaign because humanity would see reason once they lost a few more colonies. What Vorthen did not see was the transformation happening across human space. Every mining ship that hauled ore from asteroids was being retrofitted with weapons and armor plating. Every cargo hauler that moved goods between worlds was having military-grade engines installed. Corporate vessels that had ever fired a shot in anger were being given missile pods and point defense systems. The civilian population did not protest these conversions because everyone knew someone who had died on New Terra, and everyone wanted to do something to help. Sophie Blake had been the Federation's leading xenobiologist and had spent her career studying alien cultures and promoting understanding between species. She had testified before the Senate dozens of times about the importance of peaceful coexistence and the dangers of military escalation. Now she appeared before that same Senate and gave a presentation that lasted 3 hours, detailing every biological and psychological weakness of the Calreth species. Her recommendations were coldly practical and utterly ruthless. The senators sat in shocked silence as this woman who had championed peace explained exactly how to cause maximum suffering to an enemy population. Her daughter had been a teacher on New Terra. Factory workers who had built ground cars and entertainment systems were retooling their assembly lines to produce missiles and armor plating. The conversion happened so fast that economists could not track it properly, because the entire human economy was shifting to a war footing within days. Entertainment networks stopped broadcasting shows and instead ran instructional videos on weapons maintenance and combat medicine. Schools changed their curriculums, and children who had been learning art and music were now learning first aid and emergency protocols. Nobody complained and nobody questioned because every human alive understood what was at stake. Amy Rodriguez commanded a heavy cruiser called the Defiant, and she volunteered to lead the first strike against Calreth positions. Her tactical officer was Chris Bennett, and together they had served in the fleet for 15 years. They had been friends and colleagues who enjoyed their work and believed in humanity's mission to explore the galaxy peacefully. Now they sat in the briefing room and reviewed attack plans with cold efficiency, because Amy's son had died on New Terra, and Chris had lost his parents and his sister and his 3 nieces. Neither of them spoke about revenge because words were insufficient and unnecessary. The Vreen Collective sent ambassadors to Earth with urgent messages about restraint and proportional response. They were a species that valued balance and harmony, and they worried about the precedent that total war would set. The ambassadors waited in orbit for 3 days before anyone would even speak to them, and when they finally got a meeting, it lasted less than 10 minutes. Helen Crawford listened to their concerns with blank eyes, and then told them that humanity appreciated their input, but would handle this matter internally. The ambassadors left quickly and sent reports back to their government warning that the humans had changed into something frightening. The Tarathi clans offered to mediate between humanity and the Calreth Empire because they had successfully resolved conflicts in the past. They were warrior people themselves and understood the desire for vengeance, but they also understood the cost of prolonged warfare. Their delegation arrived at the Sol system with proposals for reparations and punishment of those responsible for New Terra. Richard Cole met with them personally, and his response was brief and final. Humanity would accept no mediation and no interference, and any species that aided the Calreth in any way would be considered an enemy. The Tarathi left and advised their people to avoid human space until the war was over. Military volunteers flooded recruitment centers across every human world. Veterans who had retired decades ago showed up asking to be reinstated. Civilians with no military experience signed up for combat training. Factory workers requested transfers to munitions plants. Scientists abandoned their research to work on weapons development. The scale of mobilization was unprecedented in human history because this was not a war over territory or resources or political ideology. This was something far more primal and far more dangerous. Lisa Warren took command of a destroyer squadron and began training her crews for offensive operations deep in enemy territory. She ran simulation after simulation and pushed her people harder than regulations allowed, because she knew that hesitation in combat would mean death. Her crews understood, and nobody complained about the brutal schedule. They practiced boarding actions and close-range combat and suicide runs because those were the tactics that would be needed against a numerically superior enemy. Lisa watched her people transform from explorers into warriors, and she felt pride, mixed with sadness because this was not what any of them had wanted to become. Jake Morrison recovered from his physical injuries, but the doctors said he would need time to process the psychological trauma. He ignored their advice and reported for duty 3 days after being released from medical care. They assigned him to a supply depot because he was not cleared for combat operations, but he filed formal complaints every day until they gave him a ship. He was assigned as executive officer on a frigate called the Reaper, and his captain was a woman named Kelly Harper who had lost her husband on New Terra. They understood each other perfectly and spent their time planning how to hurt the enemy as badly as possible. Richard Cole reviewed the fleet deployments and felt satisfied that everything was proceeding according to schedule. Humanity would have a functional war fleet within 6 weeks and an overwhelming force within 6 months. The conversion of civilian ships was ahead of projections and weapons production had exceeded every estimate. He sent a final message to the other major powers in the galaxy, and his words were chosen carefully. Any species that remained neutral would be left alone, but any species that aided the Calreth Empire in any capacity would face human retaliation. He did not specify what that retaliation would entail because he wanted their imaginations to fill in the details. The Calreth Empire continued preparing for what they assumed would be a brief campaign to force human submission. Vor then allocated additional ships to patrol duty and established supply lines for a sustained occupation of human territory. His intelligence report showed increased human military activity, but the numbers still favored the Empire by a wide margin. He was confident that humanity would negotiate once they realized the futility of resistance. He had seen other young species make similar mistakes, and they had all eventually accepted their proper place in the galactic order. Humans would be no different despite their emotional outbursts and aggressive posturing. Amy Rodriguez led her fleet toward the first Calreth outpost at the edge of human space. Her ships moved in tight formation and maintained communication silence as they approached their target. Chris Bennett monitored the sensor displays and calculated firing solutions for every enemy vessel in range. The crew worked with quiet efficiency and there was no chatter on the internal channels, because everyone was focused on the mission. Amy thought about her son, and the last message he had sent her from New Terra talking about his school project on Earth history. She pushed the memory away and focused on the tactical display because grief was a luxury that would have to wait until after the killing was done. The first battle happened at Epsilon Station, where the Calreth maintained a forward operating base with 36 warships. Amy Rodriguez brought her fleet out of hyperspace at close range and immediately opened fire without any warning or demand for surrender. The Calreth commander was caught completely off guard because no sane military force would engage an enemy 3 times their size at point-blank range. Amy's ships tore into the enemy formation with missiles and railgun fire, and the surprise was total. Chris Bennett coordinated the attack with brutal efficiency and made sure every shot counted because ammunition was precious, and they could not afford to waste a single round. The Calreth ships recovered quickly and began returning fire with their superior weapons, but by then Amy's fleet was already among them and the range was too close for effective use of heavy guns. Human ships deliberately rammed enemy vessels when their weapons ran dry, and several captains vented their atmosphere to redirect power to engines and shields. The Calreth had never seen anything like this because most civilized species valued survival and retreat over pointless sacrifice. They did not understand that these humans had already lost everything that mattered, and death in battle was preferable to living with the memory of New Terra. Greg Walsh commanded a destroyer that took heavy damage in the first exchange, and his engineering section reported that the reactor was failing. He could have ordered evacuation, and his crew could have escaped in the lifeboats, but instead he plotted a collision course with the station itself. His crew understood immediately, and nobody protested as the ship accelerated toward the massive structure. The Calreth tried to shoot them down, but the destroyer was already a flaming wreck, and their targeting systems could not get a clean lock. Greg smiled as his ship punched through the station's outer hull and penetrated deep into the reactor core. The explosion destroyed the entire facility and 12 enemy ships that were too close to escape the blast. Radius. Sophie Blake's research team had been given unlimited funding and a single directive from the government: make the Calreth fear humanity more than they fear death itself. Her team worked around the clock developing weapons that violated every treaty and convention that humanity had ever signed. They created biological age NTS that targeted Calreth neural tissue and caused seizures and madness. They built nanite swarms that could dissolve ship hulls at the molecular level. They designed psychological warfare programs that exploited every fear and weakness in the Calreth mind. Sophie supervised every test personally and showed no emotion as she watched alien test subjects suffer and die in the laboratory. Nina Foster commanded a stealth frigate called the Shadowfall, and her specialty was deep penetration raids behind enemy lines. She took her ship into Calreth space and hunted supply convoys with patient determination. Her crew had installed a new weapon system that Sophie's team had developed, called a resonance generator. The device could match the harmonic frequency of Calreth bone structure and cause catastrophic failure of their skeletal systems. Nina tested it on a convoy of 6 transport ships and watched through her sensors as the enemy crews died screaming. The ships drifted intact but empty, and Nina felt nothing except a distant satisfaction that some small measure of justice had been delivered. The Calreth Empire began sending additional fleets to deal with the human threat, but every engagement ended badly for them. Human ships fought with a ferocity that seemed to defy logic and self-preservation. Damaged vessels that should have retreated instead pressed their attacks. Crews that should have surrendered instead triggered self-destruct sequences to take enemies with them. The Calreth had numerical superiority and better technology, but they were facing an enemy that simply did not care about survival. Their admirals sent increasingly frantic reports back to the homeworld, describing tactics that seemed designed more to inflict maximum damage than to achieve victory. Richard Cole implemented protocol. Nightfall over the objections of nearly half his senior staff. The protocol designated any Calreth world that supported the Empire's military as a legitimate target for retaliation. This meant factories and shipyards and training facilities, but it also meant the civilian populations that worked in those facilities. 8 admirals resigned rather than participate in what they considered war crimes. 15 captains requested transfers. Cole accepted their resignations without comment and promoted younger officers who understood that this war would be won through fear and not through honor. Lisa Warren led a strike force against a Calreth colony world that produced 70% of their advanced fighter craft. The orbital bombardment was precise and targeted only military-industrial sites, but the Calreth had built their factories in the middle of populated areas. The civilian casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and Lisa watched the tactical display with dead eyes as the numbers climbed. Her communications officer asked if they should cease fire, and Lisa told him to continue until every target was destroyed. She thought about the children of New Terra and hardened her heart against the screams coming through the enemy channels. The Vreen Collective sent another delegation to Earth, and this time they brought evidence of human atrocities. They showed videos of Calreth civilians dying in the bombardments and recordings of torture sessions in human prison camps. They demanded that humanity cease these violations of galactic law immediately. Helen Crawford watched the videos, without expression, and then asked if the Vreen had similar evidence. From New Terra, the ambassador said that the New Terra massacre was equally horrific, but that 2 wrongs did not make a right. Helen stood and told them that humanity would accept lectures on morality from species that had actually tried to stop the Calreth from murdering 2 million people. The Vreen had done nothing and said nothing, and now they could. Watch what happened when humans were pushed beyond reason. Sarah Mitchell was a young lieutenant who specialized in cyber warfare, and she had developed something called the Exodus Protocol. The program could crash every computer system on a planet simultaneously by exploiting vulnerabilities in the standard galactic network architecture. She tested it on a minor Calreth outpost first and watched as every system from traffic control to hospital life support went dark. The casualties from the initial crash were significant, but the real damage came in the following days as infrastructure failed and supply chains collapsed. Sarah deployed the protocol against 4 more Calreth colony worlds in a single coordinated strike. Richard Cole approved each target personally and made sure that warnings were sent to all neutral species about the consequences of supporting the Empire. The psychological impact on human forces began to show after months of constant warfare. Daniel Gray commanded a cruiser that had participated in 7 major engagements, and his crew was showing signs of combat fatigue. After their last mission involving the bombardment of a Calreth research station, he requested relief because he could not reconcile what he was doing with what he had believed himself to be. The station had been working on weapons development, but it had also housed families, and Daniel could not forget the children's voices on the emergency channels. He was granted leave and sent to a rehabilitation facility where counselors tried to help him process the trauma. Margaret Wells ran support groups for soldiers who could no longer sleep at night because of what they had seen and done. She was a New Terra survivor herself and had watched her entire neighborhood die in the bombardment. She understood the rage that drove these men and women, but she also understood the cost of becoming monsters. Her sessions were always full because the demand far exceeded the available resources. She listened to captains who cried about targeting civilian ships and soldiers, who described executing prisoners, and pilots who talked about the screaming that filled their dreams. Margaret offered no absolution and no easy answers because there were none to give. Ryan Foster was Nina's brother, and he led increasingly dangerous raids deep into Calreth territory. His squadron had a motto that became famous throughout the human fleet. They wanted monsters, so we became monsters. Ryan believed those words completely because he had stopped thinking of the enemy as people with lives and families. They were targets and obstacles and things to be destroyed. His crews painted kill marks on their hulls and competed to see who could inflict the most damage. The fleet psychologists flagged his squadron as concerning, but Richard Cole refused to ground them because they were too effective at spreading fear among the enemy. Vorthen watched his empire begin to crumble under the human assault and finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He had studied human military history and had seen their capacity for violence, but he had assumed they would follow the rules of civilized warfare. Instead, they fought like a wounded animal that knew it was dying and wanted only to take its killer down with it. His subordinates were requesting permission to withdraw from forward positions, and some were even suggesting negotiation. Vorthen refused because accepting defeat from such a numerically inferior force would destroy the Empire's reputation and invite rebellion from subject species. He made a final decision and began assembling every available warship for a concentrated strike on Earth itself. If he could destroy humanity's homeworld and kill their leadership, then perhaps the scattered colonies would lose their will to fight. He gathered 600 ships from across the Empire and stripped defenses from secondary systems. It was a desperate gamble, but Vorthen could see no other path to victory. His fleet entered hyperspace and headed toward the Sol system with overwhelming force. They would arrive in 3 days, and humanity would finally understand the price of defying the Calreth Empire. The intelligence reports reached Richard Cole 3 hours before Vorthen's fleet arrived at Earth, and he immediately activated every defensive measure that had been prepared over the past months. The Sol system had been transformed into something that no enemy had ever faced before, because humanity had spent every resource fortifying their homeworld. Every asteroid in the belt had been fitted with weapons platforms, and every satellite had been converted into a missile battery. The orbital space around Earth itself was so dense with defensive systems that navigation required constant computer guidance. Cole smiled grimly as he reviewed the preparations, because Vorthen was about to learn what happened when humans had time to prepare. Eric Hayes commanded a bomber wing that had been practicing their attack runs for weeks in preparation for exactly this scenario. His pilots were the best that humanity had produced, and they flew ships that carried enough firepower to crack a moon. The bombers had been equipped with Sophie Blake's latest creation, a weapon that could burn through shields using a focused beam of exotic particles. Eric had lost his wife and daughter on New Terra, and he had volunteered for every dangerous mission since then, because dying in combat seemed preferable to living with the memories. His wing was positioned near Jupiter, waiting for the order to attack. The Calreth fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, and Vorthen felt confident as he surveyed the human defenses. He could see the orbital platforms and the missile batteries, but his force outnumbered them significantly. He ordered his ships into attack formation and began the advance toward Earth with 600 warships moving in coordinated waves. His tactical officers reported unusual readings from the asteroid belt, but Vorthen dismissed them as sensor glitches because asteroids were not threats to military vessels. He was focused on reaching Earth and ending this war with a single decisive blow. Laura Kim commanded the asteroid defense grid, and she waited patiently as the enemy fleet moved deeper into the system. Each asteroid had been hollowed out and filled with weapons and reactors and targeting computers. The rocks themselves provided natural armor that could withstand tremendous punishment. Laura had personally overseen the installation of over 300 such platforms, and now she watched as the Calreth fleet sailed into her trap. She waited until they were past the point of no return and then gave the order to open fire. 300 asteroids lit up simultaneously and began pouring missiles and railgun fire into the enemy. Formation Vorthen's fleet staggered under the unexpected assault, and dozens of ships were destroyed in the first volley. He immediately ordered evasive maneuvers, but the firing solutions had been calculated months in advance, and every escape route was covered by overlapping fields of fire. His ships began taking casualties at an alarming rate, and he realized that the humans had turned their entire home system into a weapons platform. He ordered his fleet to push through because retreat would mean certain destruction, and their only hope was to reach Earth. quickly and force a surrender. Steve Parker led the fighter squadrons that launched from Earth's orbital stations, and his pilots flew with suicidal aggression. The fighters were small and fast and carried weapons designed specifically to exploit weaknesses in Calreth ship design. Steve's squadron dove into the enemy formation and targeted engine sections and sensor arrays with precision strikes. Several of his pilots deliberately crashed their fighters into enemy bridge sections when they ran out of ammunition. The Calreth point defense system shot down many of the fighters, but there were always more coming, and the humans seemed to have an endless supply of pilots willing to die. The battle raged for 6 hours, and Ford then watched his fleet being systematically destroyed by an enemy that should not have been capable of mounting such a defense. His ships were superior in every technical specification, but the humans fought with a coordination and ferocity that overwhelmed every advantage. He tried to withdraw his forces, but the humans had positioned their assets to prevent any retreat. Every Calreth ship that tried to break away was swarmed by fighters and bombed by the asteroid platforms. The casualties mounted into the hundreds, and Vor then realized that he had led his fleet into a slaughter. Richard Cole watched the battle from the command center deep beneath Earth's surface and felt no satisfaction in the carnage. He had hoped that Vorthen would see reason and negotiate, but the Calreth admiral had chosen violence, and now he would pay the price. Cole ordered Eric Hayes to begin bombing runs on the surviving enemy capital ships and authorized the use of the new exotic particle weapons. The bombers swept through the debris field and targeted the largest Calreth vessels with their experimental weapons. The shields failed almost immediately, and the hulls began to melt under the intense heat. Nina Foster brought the Shadowfall into the battle and used her stealth systems to hunt down Calreth command ships. She had upgraded her resonance weapon to work on a larger scale, and now it could affect entire crews simultaneously. She targeted a Calreth carrier and activated the device while positioned directly beneath the ship's hull. The screams that came through the open channels were horrific as 8,000 Calreth crew members died, with their bones vibrating apart inside their bodies. Nina moved to the next target without pausing because Mercy was a concept that had died with Nuterra. The Tarathi clans monitored the battle and sent emergency messages to both sides demanding an immediate ceasefire. They threatened military intervention if the slaughter continued, but Richard Cole sent back a simple response. Any ship that entered the Sol system without authorization would be destroyed regardless of its nation of origin. The Tarathi debate lasted 3 hours before they decided to stay out of the conflict, because they could see that humanity had become something dangerous and unpredictable. Their military analysts warned that humans were no longer following any recognizable pattern of warfare. Vorthen's flagship was crippled by a missile barrage, and he found himself trapped on the bridge with failing life support. He tried to negotiate a surrender, but the human channels remained silent except for weapon lock warnings. He watched as his fleet was reduced to scattered debris and realized that he would not survive this day. His communication officer managed to get a message through to the remaining Calreth forces ordering them to retreat, but only a handful of ships were still capable of movement. The battle was lost, and the Empire's main fleet had been annihilated in a single engagement. Richard Cole made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his forces to hunt down every escape pod and every surviving Calreth crew member, with one exception. A single light cruiser would be allowed to escape with survivors from Vorthen's command staff. Steve Parker's fighters began systematically destroying the escape pods and lifeboats. The pilots carried out their orders with mechanical efficiency because most of them had stopped thinking of the enemy as living beings. They were just targets to be eliminated. The surviving Calreth cruiser was rounded up by Laura Kim's defense forces and escorted to a position where they could safely jump to hyperspace. Richard Cole transmitted a message directly to the ship and made sure it was recorded on every frequency. "This is what happens when you murder our children. Take this message back to your empire and make sure everyone knows what humanity is capable of when pushed beyond reason." The cruiser jumped away carrying the terrified remnants of Vorthen's command staff and recordings of the complete destruction of their fleet. Margaret Wells watched the casualty reports from the Battle of Earth and felt sick at the numbers. 15,000 human personnel had died in the defense, but over 90,000 Calreth had been killed. The ratio was skewed because humans had refused to take prisoners or allow survivors. She knew that future generations would judge this day harshly, But she also knew that the people making those judgments would never understand what it felt like to lose everything in a single moment. She prepared for the flood of new patients that would need counseling after participating in such a one-sided massacre. The Vreen collective called an emergency session of their ruling council and debated whether to declare humanity a rogue state. The evidence of human brutality was overwhelming, and their tactics violated nearly every convention of civilized warfare. However, the Vreen were practical people, and they understood that humanity now possessed the capability to project force across significant distances. The council voted to maintain diplomatic relations but to keep their distance until the humans had time to calm down. They also quietly began upgrading their own military capabilities because the galaxy suddenly seemed much more dangerous. Jake Morrison survived the battle commanding a frigate that had taken heavy damage during the fighting. His ship had rammed 2 Calreth destroyers and his crew had boarded a 3rd enemy vessel in hand-to-hand combat. He sat in his captain's chair surrounded by bodies and debris and felt nothing except a hollow emptiness. The victory should have meant something, but all he could think about was his sister and his nephews, and how they would never know that humanity had avenged them. Kelly Harper found him sitting there 3 hours after the war battle ended, and she understood immediately what he was feeling because she felt it too. The news of the Battle of Earth spread through the galaxy within days, and the reaction was universal shock. Humanity had destroyed a fleet 6 times their size and had done it with minimal losses. More disturbing were the reports of how they had hunted down survivors and refused any quarter. The other major powers began reassessing their opinions of humanity, because clearly, these were not the peaceful explorers who had joined the galactic community just decades earlier. These were something else entirely, and nobody was quite sure how to deal with them. The Calreth Empire began to collapse within days of the Battle of Earth, and the speed of the disintegration surprised even Richard Cole. Subject species that had served the Empire for centuries saw the destruction of the main fleet and realized that their masters were not invincible. Rebellions broke out on 14 worlds simultaneously, and the Calreth military forces were too scattered and demoralized to respond effectively. The empire that had ruled a significant portion of the galaxy for over 1,000 years was falling apart, because humanity had proven that the Calreth could be beaten and beaten badly. Helen Crawford received surrender offers from 6 different Calreth governors within the first week, but she refused to even acknowledge them. She had decided that there would be only one acceptable surrender, and that was from the central government on the Calreth homeworld itself. Anything less would leave fragments of the empire intact and capable of rebuilding. She wanted total and complete capitulation with no room for future threats. Her cabinet worried that she was being too harsh, but Helen remembered the broadcast of Vorthen, explaining why New Terra had been destroyed, and she felt no sympathy for the Empire's collapse. Amy Rodriguez was promoted to admiral and given command of the fleet that would invade the Calreth core systems. Her orders were simple and brutal. Every military installation was to be destroyed, and every government official involved in the New Terra decision was to be arrested for trial. The fleet that assembled for this final campaign was larger than anything humanity had ever put into space before. Over 400 ships gathered at the staging point, and every one of them carried crews that had lost someone on New Terra. Amy stood on her bridge and looked at the tactical display showing all those ships and felt pride mixed with sorrow. The Calreth homeworld's defenses had been stripped to reinforce Vorthen's doomed fleet, and now the planet lay nearly unprotected. Amy's fleet entered orbit without resistance, and she broadcast surrender terms directly to the planetary government. Unconditional surrender within 6 hours or the orbital bombardment would begin. She meant every word, and the Calreth leaders knew it because they had seen the recordings from the Battle of Earth. The government building transmitted its acceptance after 4 hours, and Amy ordered her Marines to secure the capital city. Chris Bennett led the first landing force, and his Marines moved through the streets with weapons ready for any resistance. The Calreth civilians watched from their homes with fear in their eyes, and Chris felt a moment of uncomfortable recognition. They looked like the humans of New Terra must have looked when the bombardment began. He pushed the thought away because sympathy was dangerous, and these people had supported an empire that murdered children. His orders were to secure government buildings and arrest specific individuals, and he intended to carry out those orders precisely. The war crimes trials began 3 months later, and the proceedings were broadcast across the entire galaxy. Richard Cole insisted on transparency because he wanted every species to understand exactly what had happened and why humanity had responded with such violence. The evidence presented was overwhelming and detailed every decision that had led to the New Terra massacre. Forthan had died in the Battle of Earth, but his subordinates and the government officials who authorized the attack were all present. The trial lasted 6 weeks and the verdict was never in doubt. Sophie Blake testified about the weapons she had developed and the suffering they had caused. She spoke in a flat, emotionless voice and described biological agents and psychological torture devices with clinical precision. The judges asked if she felt remorse for creating such terrible things, and Sophie said no without hesitation. Her daughter had been 9 years old and had wanted to be a veterinarian. The courtroom fell silent, and nobody asked Sophie any more questions about remorse. Nina Foster attended the trials and sat in the gallery watching the Calreth officials defend their actions. They claimed that New Terra had been a legitimate military target because the colony supported the human fleet. They said that the deaths had been regrettable but necessary to maintain galactic order. Nina listened to these justifications and thought about the convoy she had destroyed with the resonance weapon. She had become exactly what the Calreth claimed to fear, and she was not sure how she felt about that transformation. The sentences were delivered in a single day, and they were harsh by any standard. Execution for the senior leadership and life imprisonment for everyone else involved in planning or executing the attack. The Vreen Collective protested that such punishment was excessive, but Helen Crawford pointed out that 2 million humans had received death sentences without any trial at all. The executions were carried out publicly and broadcast across human space. Margaret Wells watched the footage and felt empty because vengeance had not brought back the dead or healed the wounds that the survivors carried. The treaty that formally ended the war was signed. 9 months after New Terra's destruction, the Calreth Empire ceased to exist as a political entity, and its territory was divided among the former subject species. Calreth worlds were placed under human supervision until a new government could be established with proper safeguards. The galaxy watched nervously as humanity took control of vast territories and military assets. Richard Cole assured the other powers that humanity had no imperial ambitions, but his words rang hollow given the scale of human military expansion. Jake Morrison requested a transfer back to New Terra after the war ended because he needed to see what had become of his home. The planet was being rebuilt slowly and carefully, with memorial sites marking every place where people had died. He walked through the ruins of his sister's neighborhood and found the foundation of her house buried under new construction. Workers were building a school on the site, and Jake asked them to stop. They ignored him until he showed his military credentials and explained whose house had stood there. The construction supervisor apologized and said they would build a memorial garden instead. Lisa Warren retired from the military 6 months after the treaty was signed because she could no longer reconcile her actions with her conscience. She had killed hundreds of thousands in the bombardment campaigns, and she knew that history would judge her harshly. She moved to a quiet colony world and tried to live a normal life. But the nightmares never stopped. She saw the faces of Calreth children in her dreams and heard their screams when she closed her eyes. Margaret Wells offered counseling, but Lisa refused because she believed that some sins should not be forgiven or forgotten. The galaxy's political landscape changed dramatically in the years following the war. Humanity was now recognized as a major power, and other species approached them with careful respect. The Vreen Collective established formal diplomatic relations and trade agreements. The Torathi clans offered a military alliance that humanity accepted with conditions. Smaller species that had been considering expansion into human space quietly abandoned those plans. Everyone understood that humanity could be reasoned with and traded with, but threatening their civilians would result in total war. Helen Crawford stood before the United Earth Council 5 years after New Terra and delivered her final speech as president. She spoke about the cost of the war and the price that humanity had paid for its victory. 14 million Calreth had died in retaliation for humanity's 2 million, and that ratio would be debated by historians for centuries. She did not apologize for the decisions she had made because she believed they had been necessary. She did warn that humanity must never forget what it had become and must work to ensure that such transformation would never be needed again. Ryan Foster continued to serve in the military and trained new pilots in advanced combat tactics. His squadron's motto had spread throughout the fleet, and young officers quoted it with pride. He taught them how to fight without mercy and how to prioritize mission success over personal survival. His methods were controversial but effective, and the fleet command refused to change his curriculum despite complaints from civilian oversight committees.
Ryan believed that the galaxy needed to see that.
Humans could still be monsters if the situation required it. Amy Rodriguez visited New Terra on the 10th anniversary of the massacre and stood before the memorial wall where every victim's name was carved in stone. She had served as fleet admiral for 7 years before retiring to spend time with her surviving family. Her son's name was there among the 2 million others, and she placed flowers beneath it, like she did every year. A young girl approached and asked if Amy had known someone who died, and Amy said yes while fighting back tears. The girl said her grandmother had died there too, and they stood together in silence. The memorial had become a place of pilgrimage for humans across the galaxy, and visitors came daily to pay respects to the dead. The new city built around it was vibrant and full of life, with children playing in parks and families going about their daily routines. The survivors had chosen to rebuild rather than abandon the world, and their determination had created something beautiful from the ashes. Jake Morrison worked as the memorial's director, and he made sure that every visitor understood exactly what had happened and why it must never happen again. Sophie Blake returned to pure research after the war and spent her remaining years studying ways to prevent conflict rather than wage it. She destroyed all records of the weapons she had created and made sure that the knowledge died with her research team. Her final paper argued that humanity's capacity for violence must be balanced with an equal capacity for compassion, or the species would eventually destroy itself. She died peacefully at age 73, and her funeral was attended by thousands who remembered both her contributions to the war effort and her warnings about the future. The galaxy settled into a new equilibrium with humanity as one of the major powers keeping the peace through strength and deterrence. New species that entered the galactic community were told the story of New Terra and the war that followed. The lesson was clear and simple. Humans preferred peace and cooperation, but threatening their children would unleash something terrible and unstoppable. Most species took that lesson to heart and maintained friendly relations with humanity. Those few who tested the boundaries learned quickly that the humans had not forgotten how to be monsters when necessary.